question is, how much authority does a president have to decide when temporary immigration protection has lasted long enough? Well, my friends, you're about to find out today. President Donald Trump, yes, our president, just scored another significant victory in his immigration agenda. His supporters will be very happy. A federal judge has cleared the way for the Trump administration to terminate temporary protected status, or TPS, for nearly 1,100 Somali nationals living in the United States right now. And here's what makes this story bigger than those 1,100 people. This isn't happening in isolation. The Trump administration has been systematically trying to terminate TPS protections covering immigrants from multiple countries, and he's been successful. And then a major Supreme Court decision in June fundamentally changed the legal battlefield for this. So the real question isn't simply, can Trump end TPS for Somalians? And after this ruling, the answer appears to be yes, he can, and maybe he can do it to a lot more immigrants. Welcome to Money Politics Simplified, where we separate the political talking points from what the law and the numbers actually say. Please like, follow, share, subscribe, and comment. On August 14th, the U.S. District Judge Allison Burroughs in Massachusetts lifted the court order that had temporarily prevented the Trump administration from ending Somalia's TPS designation. That means the Department of Homeland Security can now move forward with terminating those protections while the underlying lawsuit continues. Sounds crazy, right? You think you would have to wait, but no, they're moving forward. And there's an important distinction here. The judge did not necessarily declare every argument made by the Trump administration correct. Instead, Judge Burroughs concluded that the challengers had not demonstrated the likelihood of success necessary to continue blocking their administration. In fact, the judge acknowledged that Somalia TPS holders had made a convincing showing that they could suffer irreparable harm if those protections disappeared. But irreparable harm alone isn't enough. You also have to show that you're likely to ultimately win the legal argument. And she felt like that was a no. And that's where the challengers ran into a major problem, aka the Supreme Court. Before we go any further, understand what temporary protection status actually is, okay? Congress created TPS in 1990. It allows the federal government to temporarily protect eligible people already inside the United States when conditions in their home countries make returning unsafe. That could include war, natural disasters, political instability, or extraordinary circumstances. TPS generally protects eligible recipients from deportation and allows them to obtain authorization to work in the United States. You know, the thing that most people want you to do, work. But here's something that gets misunderstood very easily. TPS itself does not create permanent residency or automatically provide a pathway to a green card. The federal government's own notice terminating Somalia's designation explicitly explains that TPS does not result in lawful permanent resident status or another immigration status. It's exactly what the name says, temporary protected status. And this where the Trump administration argument becomes politically powerful. Somalia was first designated for TPS in September 1991. Think about that. George H.W. Bush was president. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Michael Jordan, number 23, hadn't even won his second NBA championship yet. And Somalia's TPS designation continued through repeated extensions and redesignations over more than 3 decades. The Biden administration extended and redesignated Somalia's TPS again in 2024 for another 18 months, running from September 2024 through March 17, 2026. The Trump administration came back into office and essentially said, no, boy, that's not happening. No, they said temporary means temporary. No more extensions will be granted. DHS concluded that Somalia no longer satisfied the statutory conditions necessary for the designation and announced that TPS would terminate on March 17, 2026. But here's where this story becomes much more complicated for everyone. Somalia isn't exactly Switzerland. the country continues to face serious security problems, including terrorism and conflict involving Al Shabaab. And the challengers argue that sending people back into these conditions could expose them to enormous danger. They also allege that the administration's decision was influenced by racial and national origin discrimination. The lawsuit was brought by organizations including African Communities Together and individual plaintiffs. Their amended complaint alleges discrimination based on race and national origin, due process violations, and challenges whether the government officials who terminated Somalia's TPS had the legal authority to do so in the first place. So this isn't simply Trump says temporary means temporary. The opposing argument is temporary status can legally continue when the dangerous conditions that justified it continue. Makes sense. And that's the legitimate legal and policy debate going on right now. Okay, this is probably the most important part of the entire story. So make sure you're staying awake for this part, okay? The Somalia case didn't develop in a vacuum. In June, the Supreme Court issued a decision that significantly restricted lower courts' ability to review the DHS decisions terminating TPS. That case involved the Trump administration's attempts to end the protection involving Haiti and Syria. The court's ruling subsequently became extremely important in other TPS cases, as you could figure it out. We've already seen courts clear the way for the administration to terminate protections involving South Sudan and Myanmar, and now Somalia. Judge Burroughs had initially blocked Somalia's termination, but after the Supreme Court ruling, the legal landscape changed dramatically. That's why this is bigger than one federal judge. The Supreme Court changed the rules governing the battlefield underneath these cases. Did you know that these people are actually affected? This isn't an abstract constitutional argument going on right now. TPS provides two enormous protections. Two, protections from removal and authorization to work legally. Once TPS protections disappear, a person's situation depends heavily on whether they have some independent legal basis to remain in the United States. That's one. That's important. Ending TPS does not necessarily mean every affected Somali is immediately placed on an airplane and deported back. So some people may have possessed another immigration status or another pending claim. Others may not, but TPS itself will no longer provide the protection that prevented removal, and that potentially exposes affected individuals to detention and deportation proceedings. And I've seen what those detention centers look like, and they are just regular county jail cells until they get picked up with no idea of when they're going to get out. That has to be scary. Now we get into the argument Americans are actually going to have. Trump supporters will say, what's the point of calling something temporary protected status if temporary protection can effectively continue for 35 years? They have a point. Let's be honest. That's a fair question to ask. If Congress intended TPS to function as temporary humanitarian protection, should presidents be allowed to continuously extend a country's designations decade after decade? But opponents have equally important questions. What happens when the underlying dangerous conditions really do continue for decades? Should the United States terminate protection simply because a lot of time has passed by? That's where immigration law collides with reality. Wars don't necessarily operate according to congressional timelines. Neither do failed governments. Neither does terrorism. Here's another part of this conversation that politicians from both parties sometimes avoid. Congress created TPS. Did you know that the Congress has repeatedly allowed presidents and the executive branch to enormously have consequential decisions about who receives those temporary protections and when those protections should end? So TPS has been going on under Republican and Democratic governments for years. That creates dramatic policy swings. One administration extends protection, another terminates it, another court blocks the termination, then the Supreme Court intervenes. Meanwhile, immigrants can spend years or decades building lives around a status that Congress deliberately labeled temporary. Regardless of where you stand on immigration, that's an unstable system at best for someone who's trying to have a normal life. So, did President score a major legal victory? Yes, he did for all his supporters. A federal judge has cleared the administration to move forward with terminating Somalia's TPS designation, affecting nearly 1,100 people in this country. But don't confuse that with the entire lawsuit disappearing. The underlying legal challenge continues. And don't confuse TPS termination with automatically deporting every Somalian American. This ruling concerns a specific group of Somalian nationals who rely on TPS for protection. The bigger development is what we're seeing across the country. The Supreme Court's June decision has dramatically strengthened the administration's position as Trump attempts to dismantle TPS designations involving multiple countries. If an immigration program is called temporary protected status, should any country's designation be allowed to continue for 20, 30, or even 35 years? Or if the country remains dangerous, should protection continue for as long as necessary? That's the debate, everyone. That's the question I want you to answer. I'm Esco, and this is Money Politics Simplified. Please remember to like, follow, share, and comment. Stay informed, stay engaged, because immigration becomes a much different conversation when we stop arguing slogans and actually examine what the law says. Have a good night.
Yeah. Esco Latimer. Talking money, talking power. Follow the paper and you find a throne. Deals in the back while the cameras roll. Who's funding fear? Who's buying hope? Who's pulling strings every time we vote?